Hello and welcome to DFS Coach Talk. It is Thursday, May 7th, 2020. I am Andrew Hansen, and I'm psyched to be joined again by Shane Caldwell. Shane, it feels like it's been quite a long time. How are you today?
Yeah, it's been a few days, and I'm doing great. Excited for the Saints preview today as we continue our DFS team previews down in the Bayou there, Who Dat Nation. So it's an exciting team, and man, this is a team that's coming in as a Super Bowl contender again, as they have the last few years, and excited to see if they can get over the hump, and excited to see how the team's going to look for fantasy, because they are a great fantasy team too.
Yeah, they really are. They've had two rough finishes in the postseason, though, the last 2 years. And we may need to we may need to begin today's show with a little bit of controversy. I think we have opposing views on how things finished up last year when Kyle Rudolph caught that touchdown in the back of the end zone to send the Vikings onward, and the Saints, after a 13-3 season, once again left shaking their hands looking for a flag.
Yeah, well, I'm going to say the Saints need to, just win in other ways, because you can point out to one play, but guess what? They had other opportunities to win that game. But yeah, that was that controversial game. Obviously, in 2018, you got them. That was the game against the Rams, the controversial play, and then he takes out the receiver, doesn't call pass interference, and that one was really blatantly obvious. And then you had the Minnesota Miracle with Stephon Diggs. That wasn't a penalty. That was just a crazy fluke play. That was awesome if you're a Vikings fan. And then last year they're facing the Vikings at home, obviously favored at home in the wild card round, and yeah, it goes to overtime. Vikings get the ball, go down, and they get Kyle Rudolph out there on the left side against Williams, who's not a great corner. And they were kind of hand fighting, physical back and forth, and Rudolph catches the touchdown in the end zone, in the corner of the end zone, for the win. And my opinion was, I watched that live, we rewatched it, is that they were hand fighting back and forth, and that's kind of the physical nature of trying to create separation. And yeah, Rudolph did extend his arm into the chest, but I feel like Williams was also grabbing his hand and being physical with him, and they were fighting the whole way. So I feel like Rudolph just out physicaled him, and is a bigger guy, so he went up to get the pass. So I'm okay with it, with the refs letting it go, but I think that you have a different opinion there.
I do.
I understand.
In regular speed, it doesn't look too flagrant. I'll give you that. But if in the slow motion, if you look at one of the angles, to me, he just times it perfectly, shoves him in the middle of the chest, and gets that few inches that he needed to then have separation, make the catch. I mean, at a minimum, it was a brilliant play by a veteran doing just enough within the rules to get the edge that he needed. But I think it was worthy of a flag. I think he gained an advantage from the push. And, the other thing that comes up with this, of course, is the overtime rules. And I think they need to be changed, at least in the playoffs. You can't let, a Super Bowl hinge on the flip of a coin. And you can say all day long, well, you should have done more in regulation. I get that. But, I mean, this is just,
that came up for the 2018 Patriots AFC
exactly.
Championship game. Everyone wanted, hey, let's give Mahomes a chance in the overtime. And Brady takes him down and scores and wins, and Mahomes doesn't even get the ball in overtime. So, yeah, that definitely, I understand that point. I agree with you there. I just think that in the NFL, you're going to get a lot of hand fighting and a lot of pushing that's not called, and if both guys are battling, it just kind of cancels each other out, which I feel like Williams was on him enough where they were both battling, and I just feel like he lost the battle. So if it's just one-sided, where the other corner, has a little separation, the other guy just completely extends his arm and clears him out, then that's a blatantly obvious pass interference on offense. But I feel like it's got to be super blatantly obvious. And when you have contact back and forth, it kind of cancels it out. It's kind of like basketball, where you say they're letting them play a little bit more physical. They're allowing a little bit more hand checks and a little more physical play in there. Where some refs are calling the ticky-tack everything. So depending on the referee, I think the referees were letting some of those calls go, and that's how they were playing. That's how they were calling it. So that's why I was okay with it.
bottom line, it was just a rough finish for the Saints. So they've got to be thrilled about a clean slate here, getting after it in 2020. So we'll begin the breakdown in a second. But for those of you who are new to the program, thank you for tuning in here to DFS Coach Talk. You can check out our website, DFSCoachTalk.com. That's pretty easy, right, Shane? And you can pick up a weekly, monthly, or annual membership, and those will be frozen until a U.S. professional sport resumes. And we've been busy here, even though we're still in the downtime. We're off to a terrific start with the Korea Baseball Organization, the KBO. And if you join as a member right now, you'll get access to our free lineups every night on DraftKings and FanDuel. And, it's a real opportunity to build the bankroll while we wait for these sports to come back.
Are you saying that these are real baseball players, that they're not like, computer generated players? And
I've seen it with my own eyes.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, we're excited about that. We've had great success right out the gate, and our sleeping schedule might be a little bit off. I think we might be on more Korean time than Eastern Standard U.S. time.
No doubt.
But anything, that's what it takes. We'll dive into those things. So that's been exciting to have real baseball back, and I think that brings more hope for all the other major sports over here to get going as they see a good example of a league that's operating efficiently and drawing good I'm assuming really good ratings and viewership.
Yeah, you got to figure worldwide their numbers have to be at an all-time high. It's all we have to watch, and they're certainly concerned with the ratings. They have cheerleaders there at the games, no fans, but they've got players and cheerleaders, and fingers crossed that they can keep going smoothly, keep the league going, no more controversies. And that'll set an example for the U.S. sports. Who, by the way, NFL sent a memo out today. Roger Goodell starting to communicate with teams about opening the facilities. Stage 1 will be for team employees and players who are recovering from injury. And then they'll have to work towards stage 2 to get players actually back in the facilities and practicing. But, we're starting to get on the right track. So let's jump into the Saints breakdown here because we're finishing up the NFC South today. We're in the middle of our 32-day virtual tour of the NFL, one team per day. We're breaking them down from a DFS perspective. And we're going to start with these New Orleans Saints today, 13-3. We talked about how the season ended. But unlike some of the other teams we've been talking about, a lot of stability for this crew. I think that's one of the words of the day is stability and consistency. And I just want to break down this coaching staff a little bit because I hadn't even realized how long offensive coordinator Pete Carmichael had been in town. He's been with the Saints since 2009, and man, have they been consistent. 10 straight years where they're top 10 in yardage in the NFL. Same thing for points, top 11 in points every single year he's been there. And in fact, they've had 4 straight years where they're top 4 in scoring in the NFL. And last year was no different. They were 3rd in points with 458. And then on the defensive side, Dennis Allen, former head coach of the Raiders, and he's been there for 5 years now as defensive coordinator. And after he got his feet wet that first year, they've had 4 straight years where they've gotten a higher ranking in terms of yards allowed overall. So just consistency across the board, and that's got to feel good for the Saints fans as we get ready for this 2020 season.
Yeah, they didn't have to make a lot of offseason moves because they are really a model of consistency, the way Sean Payton and his staff does. Joe Lombardi's been there for a long time with Drew Brees, the quarterback coach and the offensive defensive coordinator. They do a great job and definitely getting the most out of their players. And this team had 11 Pro Bowlers in 2019. So, I mean, that's got to be like a record. I mean, they're just looking not just on offense all around. So having 11 Pro Bowlers, the 9th ranked team on offense, and, the defense is pretty solid as well. It's definitely a great team, and there's a lot of good fantasy production out of this offense, and it's fairly predictable as well, which is good in the world. So you try to identify when they're going to have blow up games.
Yeah, Drew Brees certainly has been at the center of that consistency, and they were 7th in passing yardage last year, second in touchdowns with 36. Breeze missed 5 games, but Teddy Bridgewater did an admirable job filling in. And then they were middle of the pack in terms of rushing yardage, certainly didn't need to rely on the rushing game quite as much because of that excellent passing game. On the defensive side of the ball, the passing yardage is where they are still a little bit below average. They're 20th last year in that department. But they were, again, 4th against the run in terms of overall yardage. And that's 2 straight years that they've been top 4 in rushing defense in terms of yards allowed. So just real strong on both sides of the ball. Arrow pointing up for the Saints. And, Drew Brees is back in town. There was a little bit of an uncertainty. Would he retire? Would he go to the broadcast booth? But he is back under center for the Saints. And, I wanted to mention some of the similarities that I actually have with Drew Brees. They're pretty substantial, Shane. We're born in the same year, same height, same weight. But then that's when we start to differ. Okay, he's right-handed. I'm left-handed. I know you are as well. And he happens to have the most passing yards in the history of the NFL, most touchdown passes in the history of the NFL. I've got some goose eggs in those categories. Man, what an incredible guy. And he's back for another year.
Yeah, I mean, this guy is one of the greatest athletes of all time. Obviously, at one of the most important positions, quarterback. But if you combine that with all the records he has, his consistency, his leadership, and his off-the-field stuff, I mean, I know that he just his foundation donated $5 million for the COVID-19 relief, especially in the Louisiana area. His charity has donated over $35 million, since he came up with his charity with him and his wife does a lot of that stuff as well. So in terms of his contribution as a person in the community and a leader, and then the fact that he's going to break almost every passing record in the NFL history, almost every single one. This guy's got to go down as one of the greatest athletes of all time. And he's just a great guy. You think about 2018 when he passed Peyton Manning for the passing yards leader in the career. And you remember when his kids were on the field, he had like a really long touchdown to Traquan Smith. His kids were on the field and they stopped the game for him to celebrate. And you just remember that was just an amazing moment. Do you remember that? That was pretty phenomenal.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I still remember watching with my wife, and she was just noticing how big his family was, all the cute kids. So yeah, that one's in the memory bank for sure.
Yeah, that's just pretty amazing. So Drew Brees, in terms of fantasy production, he obviously got hurt. I believe it was a thumb. Was it a fractured thumb, if I remember right?
Yep.
He only played in 11 games, really only about 10 games because he got hurt in one of those games there. He still put up almost 3,000 yards, and he continued his elite efficiency at 74.3% completion, by far the number one completion percentage quarterback, most efficient. And when I was looking up that stat, I knew he was number 1. But would you guess who was number 2? I'm going to quiz you now, because this one I would have never guessed in a million years.
Oh,
I don't
gosh.
know. Unless you were looking at the stats, no one would guess this. I'm just going to throw it out there because I thought it was crazy.
Somebody like Garoppolo?
It was Derek Carr from the Oakland Raiders.
Oh, wow.
Second for completion percentage at like 70%. I just thought that was interesting. No one would have guessed that unless you happen to be a Raiders fan or something like that. So anyways, that was an interesting stat. Number 1 in that stat, 27 touchdowns and only 4 interceptions. So you talking about, efficiency, a model of efficiency, and only 11 games to produce like that. This guy is awesome. Top DraftKings games, he had 43-point DraftKings games, which would have equated to 40 points on FanDuel. And then he had, quite a few other games around 30, 31, 29, 26. So he had some pretty good fantasy games, even though he only played 11 games overall. But yeah, pretty amazing. And here's one of the things I want to look at for DFS. One of the things I identified with Drew Brees is most people know that he's way better at home. So his home road splits are really good. So you want to go play Drew Brees at home. But I also noticed that his top 3 games in fantasy were up against at home up against non-divisional opponents. So that's one thing to keep in mind. You can target non-divisional opponents because we talked about the consistency of the offense. The division knows the offense really well when they're playing them on defense because they've had the same system. So sometimes they don't do as well against even the Atlanta Falcons. They had a game where they didn't do well and they lost to them, even though the Falcons weren't a great defense, right? For example. So there was that huge game against the 49ers in the Dome in New Orleans where it was a crazy shootout game that came out of nowhere. And that was Drew Brees' biggest game at like 43 fantasy points. He had 349 yards, 5 touchdowns passing, and 1 rushing touchdown from like the 1-yard line. So that was a game where you might have faded it, but if you played that, you were going to cash big because if you were afraid of the 49ers, but the 49ers were a team that had a powerful offense. You can create a shootout, which is a great environment for fantasy. And he was at home against a non-divisional opponent. So that's one thing that I think that we can look at with Drew Brees this year.
Yeah, I love that breakdown. I still remember that like it was yesterday. I was in Las Vegas for a 40th birthday party and watching it on the big screen, and he just wouldn't stop collecting touchdowns. It was incredible. What a fun game to watch. But you're right, he's so much more effective at home, and I do like that plan to target him against non-divisional opponents at home. You mentioned that loss against the Falcons, which was one of the most surprising games of the season last year. Saints were coming off a bye. Falcons came in there with a terrible record and just got all those sacks. And maybe the Saints just took them lightly, but that certainly woke them up because then the next 3 weeks they beat everybody in the division. They sort of swept the division after that. Finished 5-1 against the division, so a great record. But yeah, you got to look elsewhere for these monster games. And I want to make one more point about his fantasy production, which is just the incredible floor that he has and the consistency. In those 10 games where he actually played a full game, other than the one against the Rams where he got hit early, his hand hit the helmet on a pass and out he went. 8 of those 10 games, he had at least 2 touchdown passes, and a bunch with 3, 4, or 6 total touchdowns in that game against the 49ers that you mentioned. So just incredibly consistent. And oh, by the way, the cheapest price he had all year was $5.9K on DraftKings, and it was against the 49ers. So if we ever get any sort of a dip in price in one of these home games, I think he's a really important target to play. Now, as for the rest of the quarterback group, this is an interesting dynamic because Teddy Bridgewater, their backup, signed with Carolina, and we talked about him a couple days ago. And in his stead, they have signed Jameis Winston to a 1-year deal for $1.1 million. So I'm going to ask you, Shane, what do you think about this little trade, so to speak, of losing Bridgewater and adding Winston? Do you think that's an upgrade?
For fantasy, it is. I don't know about real life, but I don't really care about real life. We're looking for DFS fantasy production here, and that's what you get for Jameis Winston. Yeah, you could lose a few points if you throw an interception, but I'm not concerned about that because this guy would rack up, if he gets to play, he's going to rack up a ton of yards and a ton of touchdowns in this offense. Teddy Bridgewater was good. He held down the ship. Being that this was a stacked, loaded roster, he was able to be a game manager and be efficient. He threw 9 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. He had about 68% completion percentage. So he was okay. When the backup quarterback was in there, his snap share was only like 66%. So they were running like Taysom Hill in there and doing the Wildcat and doing all kinds of things. Alvin Kamara on the Wildcat. So he wasn't even necessarily a full-time quarterback, but he was a game manager. He did the job. Now, Jameis Winston, obviously, number 1 last year in let's talk about the good stuff with Jameis Winston. Right?
Okay. All right.
Number 1 in passing yards at over 5,100 yards. Number 1 in deep ball passes. Number 1 in air yards. Okay. What do you have? 33 touchdowns. Okay. No, we don't need to talk about the interceptions or the completion percentage. We don't need to talk about that. But we can talk about how he actually finally had LASIK vision surgery. He was not wearing contacts or glasses, obviously, and he's talking about in the offseason how he can see better. First time he's been able to drive around and see street signs. You got a NFL quarterback who's been playing without being able to see coverage and read it correctly because he can't see that well. So that could have played into it. But if you combine this offense and the weapons they have and the coaching he's going to get from Sean Payton and from Joe Lombardi and from their offensive coordinator, this is a great place for Jameis Winston to be and develop. And I feel like if Drew Brees goes down, we're talking about a cheap price and elite level production for fantasy here.
Yeah, you make a good point there on focusing on the good. That is really what we need to do. We need to focus on the numbers and the fact that an interception, you only lose 1 point. But it's a real challenge for me because I'm morally opposed to a quarterback who doesn't value the ball. And he is the complete opposite of Drew Brees in that sense. 30 interceptions last year. Drew Brees had 4. And how about this little comparison? The last 3 years before that, 8, 5, and 4 for Brees. So he's not even close. He won't even sniff going 10 interceptions or higher recently. Winston's career low is 11, and that was in 13 games. So just not even anywhere in the same realm of discussion in terms of taking care of the ball. And then we talked on the earlier podcast about Winston's sacks, 48 sacks, I think it was. Meanwhile, Brees only took 12 sacks, 3.1% of the plays, which was best in the NFL. So maybe this is why Winston's referring to his place on the Saints roster as a Harvard education, because it is a real opportunity to see how it's done and learn. Because, with that history of interceptions and sacks, mistakes, I do have to give him credit that I really think it is a great decision for his career to go there, sacrifice the money, sacrifice a starting role, and try to add that part to his game and go to the next level. So,
yeah, he's actually a very intelligent guy. Winston is, and he's going to learn so much from Drew Brees. As I mentioned, Drew Brees, one of the best leaders, and that's really one of the best coaching staffs and smartest coaching staffs out there. So with the coaching staff and Drew Brees, being able to take him under their wing, he's only going to get better. And he still has that high upside and that arm talent. So really smart quarterback, great arm talent. And I'm very high on him. If anything were to happen to Drew Brees, I don't care about that other fantasy. And they're going to make him more efficient, but still allow him to take his. He's probably one of the best quarterbacks for throwing deep balls, where Drew Brees doesn't excel at deep balls. So you're going to be able to open up more big play ability in this offense if Jameis Winston goes in.
Yeah, I think we both agree that if Brees goes down, Winston will get the opportunity to be that every down quarterback. But Taysom Hill isn't going anywhere. They re-signed him. So the question,
he a quarterback?
Well, sometimes he is. He threw 6 passes last year.
Yeah, he completed.
He did have much more of an impact running the ball and catching the ball. So how much of a vulture do you think he's going to be this year to those other skill position players for the Saints?
Yeah, it's worrisome. I mean, he even takes red zone snaps from Drew Brees, who's like, Hall of Fame quarterback. And yeah, he's taken some of those passes from Michael Thomas in the red zone, because Michael Thomas, wasn't necessarily a touchdown leader. Right? He was pretty solid. It really hurt Alvin Kamara's production, because Taysom Hill excels with those quick short routes and just his quickness and speed and physicality in the red zone in his hands. He really vultured those directly from Alvin Kamara, who was supposed to be one of the top running backs. So yeah, this guy is Taysom Hill is one of the most versatile players that you'll ever see. But you just never know when he's going to be in there. There is very, very package specific, very play calling specific, and they're just going to throw him in there for specific plays. And he's not going to get that many snaps, but enough just to take away from these other fantasy stars. So yeah, so he's always lurking as the vulture there, the kind of jack of all trades vulture there. So
yeah, he really is. And just impressive that he was able to end up with those 6 touchdown receptions. But I've got two sort of differing viewpoints to share on his production in terms of DFS value. So in the 6 games where he caught a touchdown pass, his DraftKings point totals were 8, 9, 11, 12, 15, and 18. And he was priced in that 4 to 4.5K range. So really, it was only a couple of those games where he gave you that 3x return or higher. So that's my concern for him is even when he's getting in the end zone, he's just not getting enough touches to really give you a tournament GPP style return on investment that you want. Now on the flip side, that's the problem. Now on the flip side, look at his numbers in that playoff game against the Vikings. 4 carries for 50 yards, 2 catches for 25, and a touchdown. So he got 17.5 DraftKings points there, and he was about 4.5K. So we're looking at about a 4x return. So, if the end of the season is any indication of how much they value him and how much they want to incorporate him in the offense, we could see him get more and more touches this year.
Yeah, Sean Payton's certainly in love with him. And he's calling the shots. So,
right.
Yeah, he can incorporate that. I know you start wondering, hey, is Alvin Kamara injured or what? Is there a secret injury they're not telling us about? Because, Sean Payton's love for him, he would just throw him in there in obvious situations where it used to be Kamara. It is concerning. He will get in there, but I think as long as Drew Brees is healthy and running the offense, it's still going to be a very minimal snap share and target share. That's always something you have to factor in if you're taking a tiebreaker between a few players. You factoring in the Saints, and that Taysom Hill could take away a touchdown that you desperately need a DFS.
It's funny that you mentioned Kamara next, because who would have thunk at the beginning of the season that Taysom Hill would end up with 7 touchdowns rushing and receiving, and Kamara only had 6. Wow, that hurts. So. Talk to me about Kamara, down from a fantasy perspective last year in terms of overall production. What do you think is going to happen this year?
Yeah, Kamara was the classic case, regression to the mean. 2017, lights the world on fire as a rookie. 2018, 18 touchdowns. So it seemed like every time he touched the ball, he's touchdown. Absolute fantasy star. And then all of a sudden, Mark Ingram leaves in free agency, goes to Baltimore. So we're like, hey, let's fire up Alvin Kamara. This guy's going to be unstoppable. He's coming off Pro Bowl year, 18 touchdowns, and the touchdown vulture and a solid running back, Mark Ingram, is no longer there. Yeah, they have Latavius Murray. So Alvin Kamara coming into the year, a lot of people would have rated him above Christian McCaffrey. Some people would have rated him as the number 1 running back going into the year. And he was priced accordingly. He was pretty expensive. So he became a fantasy trap because you kept waiting for him to produce. He was okay. He was decent, which does not produce when in the DFS world here. So you're talking about 14 games. He was injured, only 797 rushing yards, 5 touchdowns, 69% snap share. It's okay, but not what we expected. Now, interestingly, he had 81 receptions all of the last 3 seasons. Great. So you would tell me he's getting 81 receptions in 19. I said, let's fire him up. Let's go. However, his average went way down to only 6.6 yards per reception, only 533 receiving yards, and only 1 touchdown. So huge regression there in terms of actual production. He wasn't involved in the offense as much. A lot of those little 2 to 3 yard passes, he catches the ball, runs out of bounds. It just wasn't producing the type of upside you need at that price. So I would expect him to have a better season in 2020, and that he had the regression. Now he's going to have the, come up or the progression now. So he is going to get, I think, more involved and have a little bit more explosive plays and hopefully get more rushing yards as well. They have a great offensive line. Great system for him. So they need to get him involved again, and I think they will. But if he's priced as high as he was last year, I'm not going to be on him as much. So it remains to be seen. What do you think about Kamara?
Yeah, I'm a little bit cautious because I was predicting him to do better last year, as you mentioned, with Ingram gone. I didn't think Murray would be quite as involved, but it really turned into more of a committee than most expected. The numbers I have are that Kamara had 59% of the snaps and Murray had 41%, which is pretty much the definition of a committee. And Murray ended up with 6 touchdowns as well, 5 rushing, 1 receiving, just like Kamara. And he was almost as productive on a per carry basis, 4.4, slightly more efficient with his catches, 6.9, and it made it impossible for Kamara to hit value in that 8K range on DraftKings. And I realized looking at these two guys that their committee together really gave you about the production of Christian McCaffrey. And McCaffrey did it with one guy. And so check out this stat. The Saints ran 1,011 plays on offense last year. Okay, 1,011. Christian McCaffrey was on the field for 1,039 snaps himself. He was just out there every down. He would not go to the bench.
He was a rare workhorse, a true workhorse running back.
Just incredible consistency and output. They kept feeding him the rock, and somehow he made it through the season. But look at this. Look at it this way. Kamara had 3 games over 20 fantasy points all season. Christian McCaffrey had 2 games under 20. So he had almost all of his games over 20, and Kamara only had 3. And there wasn't that much of a price difference. I mean, certainly McCaffrey was very expensive at 10K, but he was worth it almost every single week. He was worth the additional investment compared to Kamara. And like you said at the outset, that was just not what everybody was predicting heading into the season.
Yeah, Kamara last year in DFS, it was like, this is the week. He's going to go off. This guy's got such high upside, and I'll get him at really low ownership, right? That was the week. And then you just get burned bad if you played him. He didn't have that many big games. And I feel like we're going to be saying that same thing in the early on of the 2020 season is, maybe Kamara can get back to his old self and have a huge game. And he's the type of guy that now all of a sudden you can get him at like 4 to 5% ownership, where before he would be chalky, So I think we're going to be saying the same thing, and I'm going to keep a close eye on the training camp reports of how Alvin Kamara is looking like and what they expect from him to be able to bounce back, because he is in a bounce back spot, and he is a guy that we could target at low ownership early in the year, and he could have some of those ceiling games that he used to have. So maybe Taysom Hill gets injured and we'll be okay. Wait,
yeah,
Taysom
really.
Hill's a quarterback. What? Yeah, I'm very confused
exactly.
now, right?
Yeah, in terms of the Kamara perspective, it's like all these guys are taking away from him. We've hit on Hill, we've hit on Murray, and let's turn to the receiving core, because you talk about a guy who's going to take away touches. Michael Thomas leading the league in catches, 149, led the league in receptions and receiving yardage, 1725. Absolute stud, number 1 wide receiver out there. So, is it possible that he could match those numbers again this season?
I think that Michael Thomas is so good that he can come close to that. He's due for some regression, and we can hope that he gets more touchdowns. He had 9 touchdowns, which is decent, but not considering the amount of targets and target share he had last year. So he may be able to produce similar fantasy production, but I would expect a little bit of regression from Michael Thomas. So you have to be a little bit cautious with him. Because we're going to talk about Emmanuel Sanders in a second here. That's going to take away some target share. Michael Thomas had a record 186 targets, number 1 in the league, 33.2% target share, by far number 1 in the league. So his target share and amount of targets he had and how good he was with those targets was just ridiculous. You can't expect that consistently, especially being that they brought another really good wide receiver in, where they didn't really have a number 2 wide receiver last year that you can count on. Michael Thomas, this is a guy that, I'd let you know I was in on him since training camp of his rookie year. I was on this guy, really big on him before anyone even knew who he was. They might have called him Mike Thomas at that point, so maybe it was like Michael Jordan. He went from Mike to Michael once he came out of the scene, right?
Yep.
So if you look at the first 4 years of this guy's career, He holds the record for most receptions at 470 of all time, any player for the first 4 years, and obviously 149 receptions last year is the record. And he led the league in receptions in 2018 and 19, and also led obviously in yards. So the guy is physical. He's a precise route runner, the most physical receiver that you'll probably see, the strongest hands. He hardly drops anything. And Drew Brees trusts him with that accuracy. He's not a deep ball threat, so he is who he is. He's great. He's probably even better at PPR. That big game, that shootout game, he had 44 fantasy points in the PPR world, which was great. And then on DK, he had 6 more games over 30, which was huge. And still, FanDuel had a game almost 36 points and 7 other games on FanDuel over 20. So he was the model of consistency. And if you faded him, you probably paid for it last year. So what do you think about him?
Yeah, model of consistency, like you said, incredible floor. Only 1 game under 10 fantasy points. That was the last game of the regular season, so that's a throwaway. And in that shootout against San Francisco, that was the day that he had the lowest price on DraftKings all season at 6.6K. And he gave you that 7X return with those 44 fantasy points. So once again, a note to self, next year, if Brees and Thomas dip in price, pair them up in a GPP and look for one of those shootouts, because they just can't be held down. Incredible pairing. Now, you mentioned that the Saints really didn't have a number 2 last year. Ted Ginn Jr., sort of a guy who's had a great career in terms of all-purpose yardage, but he's sort of been trending downward in terms of his receiving skills and production. He's gone now. He just signed with Chicago. And, of course, the big signing, they've got Emmanuel Sanders in town. So what's your outlook for Sanders here fitting in as the obvious number 2 for Drew Brees and company?
Yeah, I mean, with Drew Brees in this offensive system, you got to love Emmanuel Sanders. Emmanuel Sanders was coming off an injury last year, surprised a lot of people, and had a solid season. And he also, his season was a little bit, broken up because he was with the Broncos and traded to the 49ers. And the Broncos were not a good offense. They weren't good at all. They were trying to figure out quarterback situation. I think Flacco was his quarterback most of the year, which is horrible, right? And then he was traded, and you go to San Fran, who's primarily a running team. And just when he was targeted, and he did produce. He had 66 catches, 869 yards, and 5 touchdowns. So he wasn't in a good system for his strengths. He's a great route runner. He can hit you with the deep ball. He can hit you underneath. He's another one of those guys that's like a technician. I think he's a great receiver. And with teams having to focus on Michael Thomas, he is going to be a single coverage. He's going to have a lot of space to run and get open. And Drew Brees is, probably one of the best quarterbacks Emmanuel Sanders has ever played with in terms of accuracy and timing. So as long as they can get together in training camp and get down the timing, really high on Emmanuel Sanders. He's not a super high ceiling guy, but he's a very consistent performer, and he'll flash with a couple big games. But I feel like he has a great floor, and this was a huge offseason acquisition. This team was so loaded that they didn't need that many offseason acquisitions, but this is exactly what they needed. So I'm really high on him.
Yeah, and I think Sanders will have a better floor with the Saints. We do see Sean Payton game plan a lot and bring in gadget plays and different guys who it's like they've got 1 or 2 plays drawn up for them specifically to get in the end zone with the 3rd tight end or a 5th wide receiver. We've seen it. So and I'm a little bit concerned in that sense, but in general, I think it's certainly an upgrade for Sanders. I think he'll be more consistent. And, they obviously just fell in love with that performance in that shootout that we've been talking about, because he was on the other side in that San Francisco Saints shootout when he caught 7 for 157 and a touchdown. That was his ceiling game, 37.1 fantasy points. So he's obviously comfortable in that dome, and Drew Brees and company have to be very excited to have him. Now, as for the rest of the group, Traquan Smith is there, and I'm projecting him as that, 3rd most productive wide receiver. What are your thoughts on him?
So they like to line him up in the slot. You know, he's a bigger guy. He's definitely fast, physical. So he will line up in the slot and sometimes outside as well. Drew Brees did target him a lot in the red zone, so he got 5 touchdowns. So he was pretty sporadic there, but he didn't have enough volume. He had some injuries, so he only played 11 games, and he just didn't. His target share was so low, and his amount of volume he had, he really only ended up catching 18 balls, 234 yards, and 5 touchdowns. So red zone target, guy that maybe you could take if you're looking for a minimal type price guy on FanDuel or something like that, but really kind of hard to play him on DraftKings being that he doesn't catch that many balls, and he's so touchdown dependent. So not really high on him. You know, if Jameis Winston gets in there, he could throw a couple bombs to him because this guy's a deep threat. But Drew Brees, that's just not his game. So he doesn't fit that Drew Brees offense as well. And he's a big target in the red zone, though, but not really high on him.
Yeah, I agree. It's just not enough volume. But what an incredible percentage. 18 catches and 5 of them went for touchdowns.
Yeah. He was money.
That's what I'm talking about with these specific plays for specific guys. And so as we kind of look back over the backfield, the wide receivers, what I'm seeing is, an incredible concentration of targets and receptions with Kamara and Thomas. But the touchdowns, they had 6 guys with at least 5 touchdowns coming back. So that's the harder thing to get a piece of in terms of separating from the other teammates, is to try to get to that 10 touchdown mark. Nobody was able to do it. So let's transition to that the 6th guy there, and it's Jared Cook, the tight end, who's 33 years old, which doesn't sound too old, but he's already played 11 years in the NFL and coming off a very productive season in only 14 games.
Yeah, I remember he had a couple good years for the Raiders, really good receiving back. The guy is physical. He's got great hands. He runs good routes. He definitely hits you with those seam routes, hit you with, he can split out wide. He can do a little bit of everything. So, I mean, last year he was pretty much their wide receiver too. He plays in 14 games. He catches 43 balls for 705 yards. I mean, in this offense, considering the concentration Michael Thomas had, that was wide receiver 2. And he did awesome in the red zone, 9 touchdowns. He had as many touchdowns as Michael Thomas. And where he really excelled, which you wouldn't think of that for a tight end, is he was the big play guy. He was the touchdown guy. And in terms of 16.4 average yards per reception. So that was way more than Michael Thomas and these other guys. So really good run after the catch type guy, and really good actually catching balls deeper down the field with that high average for a tight end. So he was a playmaker and has definitely made some splash plays and a really big part of this offense. And I think that he'll continue good production. Again, Emmanuel Sanders and him work in the middle of the field, and Michael Thomas, and being able to line these guys up all over the place. They're so versatile, playing inside and outside. And Jared Cook, I think, is going to be another solid guy. And Drew Brees is really good at finding the open and finding the mismatch, Yeah,
and I really like the chemistry between Brees and Cook. And we saw that specifically at the end of the season. After Brees came back from injury, he got back in that rapport with Jared Cook. And Cook finished with 7 of his last 8 games over 10 fantasy points. And he had his 3 20-point fantasy games down the stretch. So I'm expecting a lot from them coming out of the gate. I want to hit on 2 other tight ends here. Josh Hill, who was out there for 61% of the snaps last year, but he only caught 25 passes, 3 touchdowns. So he took a little bit away from Jared Cook. But, the real X factor here is this draft pick that the Saints really wanted to get. They traded up in the 3rd round to get Adam Troutman out of Dayton. Tell me your thoughts on how he might fit into the offense this year.
Okay, I'm going to give you my Mel Kiper Caldwell breakdown on Adam Troutman.
Beautiful.
Yeah, small school guy, came on late. This guy played everywhere, played all around the formation, ran up wild carts. He would go in line up in the slot. You're talking guy that worrisome competition level at Dayton, kind of a worry, but we're talking about guys 6'5", 255, running 4.7, 4.8, 40, This guy has potential. 2019 really came onto the scene, lit it up, 70 catches, 917 yards, 14 touchdowns. Big red zone threat there in only 11 games. So this is the type of guy we like, kind of like a poor man's Jimmy Graham. He's going to line up all over the formation, create mismatches. Great developmental guy. Sean Payton's going to love this guy. Drew Brees is going to love him. And I'm looking for big things from this guy. I think it was a great draft pick in the third round at pick number 105.
Excellent work there. Right when you got into that Jimmy Graham talk, I think you really hit your groove on the Kuiper impersonation. I like that. Yeah. So, you talked about everybody in the room liking him, and I'm going to throw one more in there. He broke all kinds of records as a high school quarterback. So maybe, just maybe. Michigan. Yeah. So did they trade up to get him as a tight end because they love his pass catching ability, or maybe just maybe do they think he's the successor to Taysom Hill and they really view him as a quarterback and they're getting him get him back under center?
He's collecting these Taysom Hill type guys that can do anything. They can run the wildcat, they can catch balls, they can run the ball. Yeah, because he got another guy in the 7th round, Tommy Stevens, that we'll talk about. So yeah, he's collecting these jack of all trades, these Swiss Army knife guys. He loves them, and hey, it makes that offense unpredictable. You never know what they're going to do. So it's not just one-dimensional offense. So yeah, he's very creative in that matter.
Yeah, maybe we'll see him get an end-around handoff, and then he'll throw it down the field. Kamara threw one pass last year, completed it. So I mean, Taysom Hill, the quarterback, only threw 5 more passes than Kamara. So, I mean, he'll try anything. The one other thing I'll say about Troutman is I read a description of him as being quicker than fast, more quick than fast. But to be honest, watching the tape, I didn't really see quick or fast from Troutman. I thought he looked a little bit sluggish, even in the open field. I'll give him credit for running some nice routes. It seems like he has great hands, only 2 drops last year to go along with those 70 catches. So I think he can be very successful, but I think he may be a little bit limited in terms of the home run, beat everybody down the field. I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, you worry about the level of competition, like I said in my breakdown there at Dayton FCS school. So yeah, he dominated, but really overall, not elite, but very solid player. He's going to have some issues with pass, with blocking as well, whether it's pass protection, run blocking. He's not really that good at blocking. So he's kind of a situational, a big guy that you're trying to get in a mismatch, that's a pretty athletic guy.
Right. So as we mentioned, they got Troutman in the 3rd round, traded a handful of draft picks to get him. So they only ended up with 4 selections. Anybody else from the draft class, Shane, that you think we need to hear about as we get ready for the Saints and DFS this year?
Yeah, I mean, I love their 1st round pick at 24. They took Cesar Ruiz out of Michigan. He's a center. He can play center or guard, but he should start at center. And the guy is really athletic for a big guy. He's strong, athletic. He moves well in space. So I like him being able to being able to sit down, have good pass protection, but also help in the running game, getting to the 2nd level. So that could help Kamara and Latavius Murray. And I like him being able to move in space with the screen game with Kamara as well. So I think Cesar Ruiz is versatile. You can see that they value that, protecting Breeze and being able to create more space in the running and the passing game. I think that's a great pick for him. They're from Michigan. And then in the 3rd round, they took Zach Bond out of Wisconsin, who a lot of people thought was going to be a 2nd round pick. So he really fell, and he had a ton of production at Wisconsin. Definitely a lot of sacks, a lot of tackles for loss. The guy's a playmaker. I don't think he had elite athleticism when he tested. I don't have his combine stats right in front of me, but I think that's maybe why he fell a little bit. He was a little bit undersized, but he's going to help them with the pass rush, definitely as an outside linebacker. So I do actually like him in terms of his football production. I think they got a steal in the 3rd round with him as well.
Excellent. Yeah, so on Ruiz, you talked about the downfield blocking. It's just one thing I love on highlight tapes is when you see these linemen down the field looking for a second block, and then when they're celebrating during the play because they know their guy's about to go score a touchdown. Yeah, it's just nothing like that. So you can see that Ruiz definitely a team player, and you like that guy at the center of your line. So
Yeah, great offensive line already, and they're already really good at tackle and guard. So to have him added to that group, he's going to learn from them. They're a great unit, in terms of production, the pass and running game. So,
Excellent.
yeah.
Well, that about wraps up our coverage of the Saints. Let's talk about the schedule here a little bit, Shane. That concludes our coverage of the NFC South. You and I are going to be back for the Friday show as we start the breakdown of the NFC North. I guess the final question here on the Saints is, do you think they finally overcome controversy in the playoffs this year?
Yeah, I do. They're going to be my way too early NFC Super Bowl team prediction. And then I have a team in the AFC, which I've told you, but we'll save that for later. I was able to predict the Super Bowl last year, so I brag about that I predicted it pretty early, exactly how it went down. So yeah, I like them. It's going to come down to the health, just like any team, but if they can stay healthy, they have a lot of good things. I think Emmanuel Sanders could be an X factor. I think Alvin Kamara having a better season this year could be an X factor, and a full season with Drew Brees. We'll see if their defense can continue to develop. But yeah, they are definitely a Super Bowl contender, and I imagine they're going to be one of the favorites there. So.
Excellent. Well, hey, I'll take an early Super Bowl prediction, especially since you nailed it last year. I mean, there were good odds on the 49ers, early, late November, early December, great odds on them in the Super Bowl. So that's excellent. If you want the Twitter followers to get a little bit more of the insight, where can they find you?
I'm at DET Sports Shane. So DET stands for Detroit, and then Sports Shane on Twitter.
Excellent. And you can find me on Twitter at Language Olympic. You can find our group on Twitter at DFS Coach Talk. If you want some more of our insight and winning plays, then become a member at DFSCoachTalk.com. As I mentioned at the outset, we're providing lineups right now on a daily basis for the KBO, off to a very hot start. We've got some very happy members, and so we're excited to bring that content to everyone. The leader of our group, Joe Sarvati, affectionately known as Coach, likes us to mention his favorite charity, MambaOn3.org. And did I miss anything, Shane?
No, I think that's it. The memberships are locked right now. Even though we are providing the Korean Baseball League lineups, those are included in your membership, but the membership is frozen until the main U.S. sports start back up. So it's great. You can get in there. We have all kinds of cool contests going on, and we have the KBO going on as well. So a lot of exciting things going on, and we're getting into the NFL stuff. Very exciting, and we're ready for sports to be back, and we're just going to keep getting better every day.
That's right. And so it continues with the NFL coverage. We'll be back here tomorrow to break down the Lions. In the meantime, I want to thank Shane Caldwell on behalf of this good man from Detroit. I'm Andrew Hansen. Thank you so much for joining, and be sure to tune in again tomorrow for the next episode of DFS Coach Talk.